The heat was a physical presence, a weight that pressed down from a bleached white sky and radiated up from the canyon floor. Red sand, the color of a fresh wound, glowed under the sun. Kyle moved through this furnace with a patience born of a lifetime spent in such places, his moccasins leaving no more sound on the baked earth than a passing shadow. He was tracking. The skill was as natural to him as breathing a legacy of the man he used to be, etched into his very soul. Now it was a tool he used reluctantly, a ghost he could not outrun. Silence was the canyon's natural state, a profound quiet broken only by the drone of a million unseen insects and the lazy buzz of flies circling the scant droppings left by the stolen cattle. The rustlers were clumsy city men, playing at being cowboys, leaving a trail a child could follow. They thought the brutal emptiness of the landscape was their ally, that it would swallow their passage. They did not understand. To Kale, the land spoke. Every overturned stone, every broken twig was a word, a sentence. And this trail screamed of haste and fear. He crested a low ridge, his body a flat line against the rock, and scanned the basin below. 3 men. They had made a crude camp near a seep of stagnant water, their stolen herd milling nervously. They were arguing, their voices sharp and angry in the stillness. Kyle felt a familiar knot tighten in his gut. It was the old feeling, the coiled stillness before the strike. He had renounced it, buried it a decade ago with his wife and son, but it was still there, a dormant predator. He had promised himself he would never again be the instrument of violence. He was a ranch hand, now a man of quiet labor. But the De La Vega ranch, the Hacienda de las Rosas, had given him a sanctuary when he had nothing. Its mistress, Isabella, had treated him with a guarded respect that was more than any other had offered. Her cattle had been stolen. A promise made to the living outweighed a promise made to the dead. He shifted his weight, a pebble dislodging and skittering down the rock face. Instantly, the men below fell silent, hands dropping to their holsters. Kyle froze, becoming one with the sun-baked stone. Seconds stretched into minutes. The men relaxed their discipline, as sloppy as their tracking. Kyle let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He was not here to fight them. Not yet. He was here to observe, to learn to carry information back to Isabella. That was the path of the new man, the man of peace. As he watched one of the rustlers, a big man with a greasy beard, kicked at the campfire, sending a shower of sparks into the dry air. He turned to another, jabbing a finger in his chest. Kyle could not hear the words, but the anger was plain. The big man was the leader. In the ensuing scuffle, something bright and metallic fell from the leader's belt, landing unnoticed in the dust. After a few more tense moments, the men settled down, their anger simmering into a sullen quiet. Kyle waited until the sun began its slow descent, painting the canyon walls in hues of orange and purple. When the men were occupied with their meager meal, he slipped back from the ridge, circling wide around their camp. He moved with an unnerving fluidity, his path weaving through the scrub and rock until he was downslope from where the object had fallen. He crept forward, belly to the earth, the grit of the sand pressing into his worn cotton shirt. His fingers brushed against it. It was cool to the touch. He drew it back into the cover of a mesquite bush and held it in his palm. It was a spur, but unlike any he had ever seen. It was not the simple iron of a working cowboy. This was heavy, made of solid silver, intricately carved, with the image of a coiled rattlesnake, its fangs bared. It was an object of vanity, of pride, of cruelty. As his thumb traced the sharp edges of the rowel, a jolt, electric and agonizing, shot through him. The world dissolved. Not into darkness, but into a blinding flash of firelight. The scent of pine smoke and burning flesh filled his nostrils. He heard a woman's scream, his name cut short. He saw the glint of silver, the same coiled snake on the boot of a faceless man whose laughter was a death rattle. A child's cry, then silence. A profound, world-ending silence. Cale gasped, his eyes flying open. He was back in the canyon, the desert twilight closing in around him. His heart hammered against his ribs, a wild drumbeat of terror and rage. The silver spur was cold in his hand, a venomous thing. The memory was a fragment, a shard of glass from a shattered past, but the pain it carried was whole and perfect. He had thought the ghosts were buried. He had been wrong. They had just been waiting. This spur was not just a clue to a simple cattle theft. It was a key one that had just unlocked a door to a hell he thought he had escaped forever. The path of peace had just vanished, swallowed by the red dust of the past. Esperanza, Texas was a town gasping for breath. It lay huddled under the vast, indifferent sky, its dusty main street a testament to broken dreams and dwindling hope. The paint on the storefronts was peeled and faded, and a fine layer of ochre dust coated everything, a constant reminder that the land was winning. At the edge of this slow decay, like a memory of a more graceful time, stood the Hacienda de las Rosas. Its white adobe walls, once brilliant, were now stained and crumbling, and the rose gardens that gave it its name were a tangled riot of thorns and stubborn, hardy blossoms. Inside, in a study that smelled of old leather and fading ink, Isabella de la Vega was at war. Her battlefield was a ledger book, her enemies, the columns of red ink that snaked across the pages like blood vessels. She was the daughter of a Spanish aristocrat, raised to appreciate poetry and fine art, to manage a household with quiet authority. She had not been raised to fight drought's debt and the predatory ambitions of lesser men. But her father, Don Alejandro de la Vega, was 2 years gone, and his legacy of pride and poor business sense was now hers to bear. With a frustrated sigh, she pushed a strand of black hair from her forehead, leaving a faint smudge of ink on her temple. The numbers were relentless. Every stolen cow, every dried-up well, every bill from the merchants in town was another nail in her family's coffin. The dismissive looks she received in Esperanza were worse. They saw a woman, a fragile thing playing at a man's game, waiting to be rescued or consumed. They did not see the steel in her spine, a resolve forged in the fire of her father's decline. This land was her blood and bone. She would not surrender it. A knock at the door startled her. "Enter," she called, her voice sharper than she intended. Mateo, her oldest and most trusted vaquero, entered, his hat in his gnarled hands. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles carved by 70 years under the Texas sun, was grim. "Señorita Isabella," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He is here." Thorne. Isabella's posture straightened. Silas Thorne. The name left a bitter taste in her mouth. He had arrived a year ago with a seemingly endless supply of cash and a smile that never reached his cold gray eyes. He had bought the failing Miller Ranch, then the old Johnson homestead. Now his lands formed a tightening noose around the Hacienda de las Rosas. He was a vulture circling a dying beast. "Show him in, Mateo," she said, rising. She smoothed the front of her simple riding dress, a defiant gesture. She would not let him see her as the beleaguered bookkeeper, but as the mistress of this house. Silas Thorne entered the study, not with a swagger, but with a quiet, confident stride that was far more menacing. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that seemed immune to the dust of Esperanza. He was handsome in a severe way, his features sharp and precise. "Miss de la Vega," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone. "Thank you for seeing me. I trust you are well." "I am busy, Mr. Thorne," Isabella replied, foregoing any pretense of pleasantry. She gestured to a chair, but remained standing herself, establishing a subtle hierarchy. He was a guest, a petitioner. Thorne's smile was a brief predatory flash of white. "Of course. A woman of your responsibilities. That is in fact why I am here. I can see the strain this enterprise puts on you. The land is harsh. It requires a certain ruthlessness to tame. He let the word hang in the air. I am prepared to make you another offer for the hacienda. A generous one. Enough to allow you to return to a more civilized place, a life more suited to a lady of your breeding. The condescension was a physical blow. My breeding, Mr. Thorne, ties me to this land. My father and his father before him built this ranch from nothing. It is not merely an enterprise. It is my home, a home that is crumbling around you, he said softly, his gaze sweeping the room, noting the cracked plaster on the ceiling, the faded tapestry on the wall. Your father was a man of honor, but not a man of business. He held on to old ways, old loyalties. The world has changed. Sentiment is a luxury the modern age cannot afford. My father's honor is worth more than all the money in your pockets, she retorted, her cheeks flushed with anger. Thorne's demeanor remained placid, which only infuriated her more. An admirable, if unprofitable, sentiment. Consider my offer, Miss de la Vega. The elements are against you. The river runs low. Your cattle are disappearing. Soon there will be nothing left to sell. He placed a crisp, folded document on the edge of her desk. This offer is final, and it expires in 1 week. He tipped his hat and was gone, leaving a faint scent of expensive cologne and the cold chill of a threat delivered with perfect politeness. Isabella stared at the document as if it were a snake. His words echoed in her mind. Your cattle are disappearing. It was not a guess. It was a statement. He was the reason. He was the wolf, and he thought she was merely a lamb. The smell of smoke clung to the night air, thick and acrid. It was the scent of destruction. Isabella stood frozen, silhouetted against a monstrous backdrop of orange and yellow flames that devoured the night sky. The north barn, the largest of her storehouses, filled with the last of the season's hay, was an inferno. Men shouted their cries thin against the roar of the fire. Vaqueros formed a frantic bucket brigade from the well, but their efforts were pathetic, like children trying to spit out a forest fire. The heat was a living thing washing over her face, stealing the air from her lungs. This was not an accident. It was a message written in flame and ash. It was Thorne's answer to her refusal. A raw, primal rage eclipsed her fear. She saw a flicker of movement near the edge of the light, a figure slinking away toward the darkness of the mesquite grove. Without a thought, she broke into a run, her boots pounding the hard-packed earth. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice hoarse. The man, a burly shape in the gloom, hesitated for a second, surprised. It was all she needed. She caught up to him, grabbing his arm. He was one of the rough-looking men she'd seen loitering in Thorne's employ at the saloon. He tried to shake her off, but her grip was like iron. "This was you," she accused, her eyes blazing with a fury that made the man take a step back. "This is Thorne's work." The thug, recovering his composure, gave a cruel smirk, his teeth yellow in the firelight. "Got no idea what you're talking about, ma'am." "Liar," she spat. "You tell him this land is not for sale. Tell him he will never drive me out." His smirk widened into a sneer of pure contempt. He leaned in close, his breath sour with whiskey. "He ain't buying it, ma'am," he said, his voice a low, gravelly insult. "He's taking it. There's a difference." He ripped his arm from her grasp with a violent wrench that sent her stumbling backward. He melted into the darkness, his mocking laughter swallowed by the crackle of the flames. Isabella stood there, her chest heaving, the man's words ringing in her ears. "He's taken it." The pretense was over. This was no longer a business transaction. It was a war, and she was losing. The ashes of the barn settled around her like black snow, a symbol of her powerlessness. She was alone. The law in Esperanza was a joke, and her vaqueros were good men, but they were ranchers, not fighters. Her mind raced, sifting through desperate options. She needed someone the thugs would fear, someone who knew the land as well as they did, better even, someone who could fight fire with fire. A name surfaced in her thoughts, a name spoken in hushed, wary tones around town. Kyle, the Comanche. He worked for her, a quiet, solitary man who kept to the stables and the far pastures. Her father had hired him out of some strange sense of pity years ago, a decision many in the family had questioned. He was a relic of a savage past, a man most settlers looked upon with suspicion and fear. Her own family, with its proud Spanish blood, had always held a deep-seated prejudice against the native tribes they had displaced. But she had seen him work. She had seen the way he moved with a silent grace that was both beautiful and unsettling. She had seen the ghosts in his eyes. He was a man who understood violence. He was exactly what she needed, and exactly what she feared. The next morning, as the rising sun illuminated the smoldering skeleton of her barn, she found him by the corral, mending a leather strap with focused, economical movements. He looked up as she approached, his dark eyes unreadable. He had returned late last night, his report on the rustlers grim and direct. Now, in the light of this new disaster, his presence felt different. He was no longer just a ranch hand. He was a weapon she was considering wielding. "Cale," she began, her voice tight and formal, "I need to hire you." He didn't stop his work, his hands moving with practiced ease. "I already work for you, Miss De La Vega." "Not as a ranch hand," she said, stepping closer. "The fire, it was Thorne's men. They are not just stealing from me anymore. They mean to destroy me. I need a tracker, a guard. I need someone who can fight them." He finally paused, his gaze lifting to meet hers. There was a profound stillness in him, a depth of experience that made her feel young and naive. "That is not the man I am anymore." He said, his voice low and raspy, as if unused to forming so many words. "I don't believe you have a choice." She countered, her desperation making her bold. "Thorne will not stop with my ranch. He wants the whole valley. Your piece is as temporary as my barn." She took a deep breath. "I will pay you double, triple." He looked away toward the distant, hazy mountains. "This is not about money. Then what is it about?" She pressed. "Justice, survival." She saw him glance at the smoldering ruins. A flicker of something empathy perhaps crossed his face. He pulled a small, heavy object from his pocket and held it out to her. It was the ornate silver spur. "One of the rustlers dropped this," he said. "They are the same men." Isabella took it, the cold weight of the silver a shock against her skin. The coiled snake seemed to writhe in the morning light. It was a thing of pure malice. This was proof, tangible proof. "Then you'll help me?" she asked, a sliver of hope piercing her despair. Cale's eyes met hers again. The ghosts were there, swirling in the depths, but behind them a hard, cold light was beginning to dawn. "I will help you," he said. His tone was not that of an employee, but of an equal, an ally. In that moment that the lines of class, race, and history that separated them began to blur, burned away by the heat of a common enemy. The sheriff's office was the only building in Esperanza that looked solid, its stone walls and iron-barred windows a promise of order in a lawless land. It was a promise Sheriff Hobbs had long since broken. He sat behind his desk, a portly man, whose face was perpetually flushed, a fine sheen of sweat on his upper lip despite the morning cool. He looked at the silver spur lying on his desk with a practiced air of disinterest. "A spur, Miss De La Vega," he said, his voice wheezing slightly. He poked it with a thick finger. "Lots of men wear spurs. Fancy ones, too. Doesn't prove a thing. That spur was dropped by the men who stole my cattle." Isabella stated, her voice steady and clear, refusing to be intimidated. "Kyle tracked them. And last night one of Thorne's men confessed to setting fire to my barn. Confessed, Hobbs scoffed, leaning back in his creaking chair. He glanced at Kyle, who stood silently by the door, a stoic, unsettling presence. Hobbs's gaze lingered on him with open dislike. You mean he got into an argument with you while your barn was burning, and this man is your only witness to what was said? The insult was clear. An Indian's word against a white man's. His word is more honest than any I have heard in this town lately, Isabella shot back. Now see here, Missy Hobbs blustered, his face darkening. Silas Thorne is a respectable businessman, a pillar of this community. He's bringing progress. You come in here making wild accusations based on the word of him and a piece of fancy silver. Sheriff, I am demanding you investigate. Isabella insisted, planting her hands on his desk. Are you the law in this town or not? Hobbs's eyes darted nervously around the room before settling on her with a look of finality. He stood his belly, straining the buttons of his shirt. My investigation, he announced with an air of mock gravity, concludes that your barn likely caught fire due to dry conditions and a stray spark. As for the cattle rustling is a sad fact of life out here. I'd suggest you hire more guards if you can't keep an eye on your own property. He picked up the spur and held it out to her. Now I'm a busy man, if that's all. The public humiliation was a slap in the face. He wasn't just dismissing her, he was mocking her siding with Thorne so openly it was an act of aggression in itself. Her hands curled into fists. There was nothing more she could do here. The law had been bought and paid for. She turned and walked out, her back rigid. Kyle followed. As he passed the sheriff's desk, Hobbs spoke, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. You watch your step, boy. We don't take kindly to your kind stirring up trouble in this town. Some folks might take it upon themselves to finish the job that was started on your people years ago. Kyle stopped. He didn't turn around, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The air crackled with a sudden lethal tension. For a long moment, he was utterly still. Then, without a word, he continued out the door, leaving the sheriff sweating and slightly shaken. Outside, the morning sun felt harsh and unforgiving. The townsfolk who had watched them enter the sheriff's office now averted their gazes, scurrying about their business. They had all heard Hobbs's raised voice. The verdict was in the De La Vega girl and her Comanche were on their own. They were pariahs. Isabella leaned against a support post of the general store's porch, the feeling of utter isolation washing over her. She had played her hand, and it had been swatted away. They had no allies, no recourse. The system she had been raised to believe in, the structures of law and order, was just a facade, a tool for men like Thorne. He threatened you, she said, looking at Kyle. His face was a mask of stone, but she could see the effort it took to maintain it. Words Kale said, his gaze fixed on the far horizon. It was a dismissal, but she knew the threat had struck a deeper chord than he would ever admit. What do we do now? She asked the question, hanging between them, heavy with the weight of their failure. They were utterly, terrifyingly alone. Kale turned his head, his dark eyes meeting hers. The impassive mask was gone, replaced by a look of grim determination. The white man's law has failed, he said, his voice quiet, but resonant with a new, harder edge. So now we use mine. They began their war in the shadows. The failed appeal to the law had stripped away their illusions, forcing them into a partnership forged of necessity. Kyle became Isabella's tutor in a world she had only ever viewed from the veranda of her hacienda. He taught her the language of the land, a language she had lived on, but never understood. She learned that the flight pattern of a hawk could reveal a hidden water source, that the depth of a hoof print could tell the weight and health of the animal that made it, that the silence of the coyotes at night meant a larger predator was near. Their investigation into Thorne began not with ledgers and deeds, but with dirt and wind. Cale moved like a phantom along the borders of Thorne's ever-expanding territory, Isabella, a determined shadow at his side. He was teaching her how to see, and she was a surprisingly apt pupil, her sharp mind absorbing the details, connecting them with a logic he respected. One evening, they returned to the hacienda weary and dust-covered. Nakai, an elderly Apache man who had worked the De La Vega lands since before Isabella was born, was waiting for them by the stables. He was a man of few words and ancient wisdom, one of the few people Cale ever seemed to truly listen to. Cale showed him the silver spur. Nakai took it, his wrinkled fingers turning it over and over in the fading light. His eyes, cloudy with age, narrowed. "I have seen this mark," he whispered, his voice like dry leaves skittering across stone. He tapped the coiled snake. "Not here. Long ago. A band of men, not soldiers, not lawmen. They rode for money and blood. They called themselves the Serpientes de Plata, the Silver Serpents. They worked for a man who paid them to clear the way for a railroad line 10, maybe 12 years ago. They did not clear it with paper. They cleared it with fire." A cold dread trickled down Cale's spine. Fire. The word echoed the fragmented horror of his memory. He looked at Isabella, who saw the sudden tension in his jaw. The spur was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a link, a ghost, from a violent past, now connected directly to Silas Thorne. Days turned into a week. The bond between Cale and Isabella deepened, hammered into shape by shared purpose and shared danger. They spent long hours on the trail and longer nights poring over maps by the light of a flickering lamp. One night, sitting by a small, smokeless fire, deep in the chaparral, the silence between them was comfortable, no longer strained. Isabella watched the precise, deliberate way Cale sharpened his knife, his focus absolute. The layers of her aristocratic upbringing were being stripped away by the harsh realities of their fight, revealing a core of resilience she hadn't known she possessed. Cale looked up, catching her gaze. He had seen the change in her. He'd seen her hands, once soft and pale, become calloused and capable. He'd seen the fear in her eyes replaced by a hard, calculating resolve. "Thorne does not want your land, Isabella," he said quietly. The use of her first name, a small but significant shift. "He wants to break your spirit. It is the one thing he cannot buy." His observation was so astute, so far beyond the clumsy compliments or condescending pity she received from other men, that it caught her off guard. He saw her not the daughter of a don or a woman in distress, but the fighter she was becoming. "And he will fail," she replied, her voice filled with a conviction that was for the first time not inherited from her father, but entirely her own. Their breakthrough came 2 days later. Following a tributary north into Thorne's territory, Cale noticed the water level was unnaturally low, the banks muddy and cracked where they should have been submerged. Further upstream, they found it a crudely but effectively constructed dam made of earth and timber, choking the lifeblood of the valley. It was a slow, deliberate act of strangulation designed to dry up every ranch south of his property, forcing them to sell for pennies on the dollar. This discovery led them back to the town archives, a dusty, neglected room in the courthouse. While Cale stood watch, Isabella delved into decades-old property records. It took her hours, but she found it. A legal dispute dated 40 years prior. A man named Jedediah Thorne, Silas's grandfather, had lost the original land grant for the entire valley to Isabella's own grandfather, Don Esteban de la Vega, on a legal technicality. She presented the document to Cale. "This is it?" she said, a grim satisfaction in her voice. "This is his motive. It's not just business. It's revenge, a generational grudge." It made a kind of sense. The damming of the river, the hiring of thugs, the systematic destruction of her legacy. It all painted a picture of a man obsessed with reclaiming what he believed was his family's birthright. The mystery seemed solved. They now understood their enemy's heart, his motivation. But as Cale stared at the map tracing the path of the dying river, a nagging unease settled in him. The scope of Thorn's operation, the sheer expense and effort of it, felt too grand for simple revenge. It felt like something more, something bigger and far more sinister. The feeling that they were missing a crucial piece of the puzzle gnawed at Cale. Revenge was a powerful motive, but Thorn's actions felt too calculated, too vast. The dam was not just an act of spite, it was an industrial undertaking. Why go to such lengths just to bankrupt a few struggling ranches? There had to be another reason. He and Isabella rode out again at dawn, pushing deeper into the foothills of the mountains that bordered Thorn's property, into a region of steep canyons and jagged peaks that most ranchers avoided. Cale was following an instinct, a sense that the secret was not in the valley below, but in the highlands above. He had noticed that the animals, the deer, the coyotes, even the birds seemed to shun a particular box canyon, a deep scar in the earth, hidden from the main valley. They left their horses tethered in a grove of cottonwoods and proceeded on foot. As they drew closer, the land began to change. The sparse vegetation grew twisted and sickly, the leaves of the scrub oaks yellowed and brittle. The air grew still and heavy, carrying a faint metallic tang. Cale knelt, running a hand through the dry creek bed that led from the canyon. The soil felt strangely dead, lifeless. They climbed the ridge overlooking the canyon, and the full scope of Thorn's operation was laid bare before them. It was a vision of hell. The canyon floor had been transformed into a sprawling, open-pit silver mine. Dozens of men, their bodies slick with sweat and grime, swarmed over the raw earth, their pickaxes and shovels ringing out in a chaotic symphony of destruction. A crude ore-crushing mill belched thick gray smoke into the sky, and a series of wooden sluices carried water down from a hidden spring higher in the mountain. But it was what happened at the end of the sluices that made Isabella gasp in horror. The water, now a milky, toxic-looking sludge, was being channeled into a large, unlined pond. From this pond, a small, cleverly disguised runoff channel trickled down the mountainside, feeding directly into the same tributary Thorn had dammed. Mercury Cale, said, his voice a grim whisper. He had seen its effects before, when white prospectors had pushed into Comanche lands. They are using mercury to separate the silver from the ore. Isabella's mind raced, the horrifying truth clicking into place. The runoff? He's poisoning the water. He's poisoning the entire valley. It was diabolical in its simplicity. The dam wasn't just to starve them of water. It was to concentrate the poison, ensuring the slow, irreversible death of the land itself. The dying cattle, the failing crops, the sickness that had begun to whisper through the poorer homesteads, it wasn't the drought. It was Thorn. He wasn't trying to buy their land. He was trying to make it worthless to anyone but him. His goal wasn't just to possess the valley. It was to hide this illegal, highly destructive mine, the source of his immense wealth, by creating a wasteland around it. The fight was no longer about a single ranch or a family's honor. The generational grudge was a lie, a convenient narrative to mask an infinitely greater crime. Silas Thorn was murdering the land itself, and with it, every living soul who depended on it. The stakes had been raised from personal survival to the very life of their world. They stood on the ridge, two small figures, against a backdrop of industrial devastation, the full weight of what they were up against settling upon them like a shroud. They were no longer just fighting a man, they were fighting a plague. The knowledge of Thorn's secret was a heavy, dangerous burden. They couldn't go to the law, and they didn't have the numbers to confront him directly at his mine. They needed a plan, a way to expose him that he couldn't buy or bully his way out of. But Thorn was a man who left nothing to chance. He must have known they were getting closer, that their silence was a threat. And he decided to act first. They returned to the hacienda well after dark, their minds reeling with the enormity of their discovery. A strange and unnerving silence greeted them. The usual sounds of the ranch at night, the soft nickering of horses, the lowing of cattle, the distant strum of a guitar from the vaqueros' quarters were absent. A single lantern burned in the main courtyard. In its flickering circle of light stood one of Thorne's thugs and the same man Isabella had confronted on the night of the fire. He held a rifle loosely in his arms. "He's expecting you," the man drawled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Isabella's feet. Kyle moved instantly, placing himself between Isabella and the man, his body coiled and ready. "Where is everyone?" Kyle demanded, his voice low and dangerous. "Mr. Thorne just wanted a private conversation," the thug said with a smirk. "He's taken the liberty of securing your staff to ensure no interruptions." He nodded toward the vaquero's bunkhouse, its door barred from the outside. "And he's holding a special guest." From the shadows of the main house, two more of Thorne's men emerged. They were dragging Mateo, his hands bound behind his back, a raw, bloody gash on his forehead. The old vaquero was a proud man, but his shoulders slumped in defeat, his eyes filled with a mixture of pain and shame for having been taken so easily. Isabella cried out his name, taking a step forward, but Cale's arms shot out, holding her back. "Let him go," she demanded, her voice shaking with a cold, terrifying rage. "All in good time," the first thug said. He pulled a folded document from his coat, the deed to the Hacienda de las Rosas, and a pen. "Mr. Thorne is a reasonable man. He knows you've been snooping around his business up in the hills. He's willing to forget all about that. All he requires is your signature." He dropped the deed and pen on a nearby barrel. "Sign the land over to him and the old man lives." Simple as that. The ultimatum was brutal and absolute. Thorne had found her greatest weakness, not her pride, not her land, but her love for the people who were her family. Mateo had raised her after her mother died. He was the grandfather she barely remembered, the father she had already lost. "You have until sundown tomorrow," the thug continued, his eyes glinting with cruel satisfaction. "He'll be waiting at his camp. If you're not there with the signed deed, well, this old man has seen his last sunset." He and his men dragged Mateo away, disappearing into the darkness. Their laughter echoed back through the unnaturally quiet courtyard. Isabella stood trembling, not with fear, but with a fury so profound it felt like it might tear her apart. Thorne had taken their strategic struggle and made it deeply, agonizingly personal. He had removed any possibility of a calculated plan, of a clever retreat. He had given them a ticking clock and an impossible choice: sacrifice, her legacy, or sacrifice the man who was her last link to it. There was no escape. He had forced them into a final, desperate confrontation. The world was turning gray, choked by the vanguard of the coming dust storm. A relentless wind howled down from the mountains, whipping sand and grit into a stinging veil that reduced the sun to a pale, dying ember in the sky. It was the perfect cover. As sundown approached, Kyle and Isabella rode toward Thorne's mining camp. Not with a signed deed, but with a desperate, half-formed plan to rescue Mateo. The storm was their only ally, a chaotic force to match the chaos in their hearts. Thorne's camp was a fortress of raw timber and corrugated iron, a blight upon the landscape. Guards patrolled the perimeter, their heads bent against the wind. Kaisel dismounted, pressing a hand to Isabella's arm. "The storm will hide our approach," he said, his voice barely audible over the gale. "But it will also hide them. Stay close. Do exactly as I do." They moved like specters through the swirling dust, using the shrieking wind to cover their sound. Kyle dispatched 2 sentries with a brutal, silent efficiency that made Isabella's stomach clench. It was a glimpse of the warrior. He had been a man of lethal purpose. They reached the main compound, a collection of ramshackle buildings around the gaping maw of the mine. In the center of the camp, tied to a thick post, was Mateo. Silas Thorne stood on the porch of the largest building, a cup of coffee steaming in his hand, seemingly unperturbed by the elemental fury being unleashed around them. He looked calm, expectant. And beside him, looking pale and deeply uncomfortable, stood Sheriff Hobbs. As Cale and Isabella broke from cover, Thorne's men raised their rifles. Thorne held up a hand, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Right on time, Miss De La Vega," he called out. "I trust you have the paperwork." "Let Mateo go, Thorne." Isabella yelled back, her voice raw. "This is between you and me. Everything in this valley is between you and me." Thorne replied smoothly. He took a step forward, his eyes falling on Cale. He squinted, his gaze locking onto the single thin leather braid, intricately woven with a single hawk feather that fell alongside Cale's dark hair. Thorne's smile faltered, replaced by a look of dawning predatory recognition. "I know that braid," he said, his voice dropping, suddenly filled with a chilling intimacy. "The wife of the Comanche chief Black Eagle. She wove one for her husband and one for her son. A pathetic little charm." Cale went rigid, the blood draining from his face. The world seemed to slow, the roaring wind fading to a dull hum. Thorne's smile returned wider and more terrible than before. "You see, Cale," he mocked, savoring the name. "Our families have a history far more interesting than this squabble over land. You think this is about a 40-year-old grudge. That's the story I let people believe. The truth is much simpler." He gestured expansively, as if addressing an audience. "Your father, Chief Black Eagle, was a problem. He was progressive. He was days away from signing a peace and trade treaty with Isabella's father, Don Alejandro de la Vega. An alliance. They were going to share knowledge resources, create a community so strong, so prosperous, that outsiders like me could never get a foothold. They were going to build a future. I couldn't have that." The pieces of Cale's shattered past slammed into place with agonizing force. The raid, the fire, the faceless men. "So I destroyed that future before it could be born," Thorne declared, his voice ringing with triumph. "I hired the Serpientes de Plata, your friends with the silver spurs, to make a statement. We didn't just raid your village. We erased it. We burned the treaty and the 2 men who were to sign it. Your father and Isabella's." Isabella stared at him in horror, a hand flying to her mouth. Her father hadn't died of a fever on a trip as she'd been told. He'd been murdered. Murdered alongside the man whose son now stood beside her. Their histories were not just parallel. They were one single tragic story of loss orchestrated by the man before them. Thorne's vendetta was never about land. It was about destroying the very idea of peace between their peoples, clearing the board so he alone could rule. As this monstrous revelation hung in the dust-choked air, Sheriff Hobbs made his choice. He had been blackmailed by Thorne for years over a youthful mistake, a gambling debt that led to a man's death in a rigged card game. Thorne held the proof. But seeing this pure, unadulterated evil, Hobbs could no longer live with his cowardice. "Thorne," he yelled, drawing his pistol. It was a desperate, suicidal act. He fired a single shot not at Thorne, but at a massive stack of unsecured timber and mining equipment perched precariously above the porch. Thorne's men, startled, turned their guns on Hobbs, cutting him down in a hail of bullets. But his final act had served its purpose. With a deafening groan, the massive pile gave way, crashing down and creating a wall of chaos and debris, separating Thorne and a few of his men from the rest of the camp. It was the diversion they needed. In the ensuing confusion, Isabella sprinted to Mateo, her knife flashing as she cut his ropes. Cale moved toward Thorne. The fight was no longer about a ranch or a river. It was about a lifetime of stolen moments, a murdered family, a lost future. Thorne drew a Bowie knife, his handsome face contorted in a mask of rage. "I should have made sure they were all dead," he snarled, lunging. The duel was not a chaotic shootout, but a brutal, intimate ballet of violence. The wind howled around them, swirling dust and debris. Cale met Thorne's wild, furious slashes with cold, precise skill. Every ounce of him screamed for vengeance, for the savage release he had denied himself for a decade. He could feel the warrior, the predator, rising within him, hungry and lethal. He saw his mother's face in the flames, heard his son's last cry. But as he disarmed Thorn, sending the knife flying and his hands closed around the man's throat, he saw Isabella, her face pale with terror, but her eyes filled with a desperate plea. He saw the future Thorn had tried to destroy, a future of peace, and he made a choice. He would not become the monster Thorn had made him. He would not grant him the satisfaction of dragging him down to his level. With a final guttural roar that was more pain than rage, he slammed Thorn's head against a support beam. Thorn slumped to the ground, unconscious, but alive. Cale stood over him, chest heaving, the ghosts of his past, finally blessedly silent. He had chosen justice, not vengeance. The dust storm broke as quickly as it had arrived. As the last of the wind died down, a fragile, exhausted silence descended upon the ruined camp. The sky, washed clean, was a bruised purple, the first stars beginning to appear. In the quiet aftermath, the townspeople of Esperanza, roused by the sound of the gunfire and inspired by the belated courage of their fallen sheriff, arrived with rifles and lanterns, rounding up Thorn's terrified and leaderless mercenaries. Kyle and Isabella stood amidst the wreckage, tending to their wounds, which were more of the soul than of the flesh. Isabella gently cleaned the gash on Mateo's forehead, her hand steady, while the old vaquero looked at her with eyes full of pride and relief. Cale walked over to Thorn's unconscious form. Something had fallen from the man's pocket during the fight. Cale bent and picked it up. It was a small silver locket. With a sense of dread, he clicked it open. Inside, nestled against the velvet, was not a picture of a wife or a child. It was a tiny, faded photograph of a Comanche woman and her young son. His mother, his brother. A chilling, unthinkable trophy from the massacre, a memento of his greatest victory. Thorn hadn't just destroyed Cale's family. He had carried a piece of them with him all these years, a constant private celebration of his crime. Cale snapped the locket shut, the cold metal burning his palm, a final sickening testament to the depths of the man's depravity. He looked up and met Isabella's eyes across the settling dust. No words were necessary. They had both lost their fathers on the same day, to the same man for the same reason. Their families, separated by culture and history, had been bound by a shared dream of peace. And now they, the last of their lines, were bound by a shared devastating trauma. A silent, profound understanding passed between them, an acknowledgement of their intertwined histories, a shared grief that was too deep for words. In the quiet of the broken camp under the emerging stars, they were no longer a Comanche and a Spaniard. They were simply the survivors. Several months later, the valley was beginning to heal. The rains had come, washing the poison from the soil, and the river, freed from Thorn's dam, once again ran clear and strong. Life was returning. Green shoots pushed their way through the dark earth, and the air no longer carried the metallic tang of the mine. Esperanza, too, was changing. The town had been shaken from its apathy by the final, desperate acts of its corrupt sheriff and the courage of the woman they had once dismissed. A letter found in Sheriff Hobbs's desk and addressed to the Texas Rangers had been his final confession and his redemption. It detailed every facet of Thorn's network, the corrupt officials, the bribed judges, the shell companies, and set in motion a wave of arrests that cleansed the territory of his influence. Silas Thorn himself was gone, taken by federal marshals to face a trial whose outcome was certain. Isabella de la Vega was no longer just the mistress of a failing ranch. She was the architect of the valley's future. The Hacienda de las Rosas, its debts cleared by the seizure of Thorn's assets, had become the heart of the community. She worked with the other ranchers, sharing resources, establishing fair trade, and slowly, painstakingly rebuilding the dream of a stable, prosperous community that her father and Cale's had envisioned. One cool autumn evening, Kyle found her by the newly rebuilt rose gardens. He carried a long, slender object wrapped in soft buckskin. He had not spoken of his past since that day at the mine, but a quiet peace had settled in his eyes, the ghosts finally at rest. He stood before her and unwrapped the bundle. It was a peace pipe, its wooden stem worn smooth with age, its stone bowl intricately carved. This was my father's. Kyle said, his voice soft. He was to smoke it with your father on the day they signed their treaty. For a decade, I have carried it as a symbol of what I lost. He held it out to her. Now I think it is time it became a symbol of what we can build. Together, they walked to a small, newly cleared patch of ground at the center of the hacienda's main courtyard. In the middle of it stood a young, freshly planted olive tree, its slender leaves silver in the moonlight. They dug a small hole in the soft earth at its base. With a shared look of solemn understanding, they placed the pipe within it, a relic of a violent past being laid to rest. As they covered it with soil, burying the generation of violence and revenge, they were not just burying an object. They were planting a future together, built not on blood, but on peace and a hard-won mutual respect.